Between 1903 and 1922, 189 souls entered the sacred grounds of Saint Bartholomew's Monastery in the remote mountains of northern Montana, seeking spiritual solace and divine guidance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Not a single one of them ever walked back through those heavy wooden gates alive. For over a century, the official records maintained by the Catholic Diocese of Helena listed these individuals as having completed their spiritual retreats and departed to continue their journeys elsewhere. But recently uncovered correspondence, hidden beneath the monastery's ancient stone floors, tells a horrifying story of systematic murder disguised as holy sanctuary. The victims weren't just nameless wanderers. They were mothers fleeing abusive marriages, war veterans haunted by battlefield memories, young men questioning their faith, and elderly pilgrims seeking peace in their final years. Each arrived carrying hope for redemption and healing. Each disappeared without leaving so much as a footprint in the snow-covered paths leading away from the monastery walls. What makes this case even more chilling is that Saint Bartholomew's operated under the direct oversight of church authorities, who not only knew about the disappearances, but actively participated in covering them up. The monastery sat perched on a wind-swept plateau 8,000 feet above sea level, accessible only by a treacherous mountain road that became impassable during the harsh Montana winters. This isolation wasn't accidental. It was carefully chosen to ensure that whatever happened within those walls would remain hidden from the outside world. The few local residents who lived in the valley below spoke in whispers about strange sounds that echoed from the monastery during the darkest nights, sounds that resembled human screams carried on the mountain wind. The story of Saint Bartholomew's Monastery begins in 1887 when Father Vincent Kowalski, a Polish immigrant priest with a mysterious past, petitioned the Diocese of Helena to establish a retreat center for troubled souls seeking spiritual guidance. Church records describe Kowalski as a charismatic leader with an unusual understanding of human psychology and an ability to attract followers who seemed completely devoted to his teachings. What those records don't mention is that Kowalski had been quietly transferred from 3 different parishes in the eastern United States following unexplained disappearances of parishioners. The monastery itself was built using local stone quarried from the mountainside, creating a fortress-like structure that blended seamlessly with the rocky terrain. The main building housed a chapel, dining hall, library, and sleeping quarters for both residents and visitors. Behind the main structure stood a series of smaller buildings that served various purposes, including workshops, storage facilities, and what Kowalski described as meditation chambers for those requiring intensive spiritual counseling. Father Kowalski assembled a core group of 12 monks who would assist him in operating the retreat center. These men, later investigation would reveal, were not ordained priests, but rather carefully selected individuals who shared Kowalski's twisted vision of spiritual purification. Among them was Brother Marcus Chun, a former military doctor who had been discharged under suspicious circumstances, Brother David O'Brien, a skilled craftsman with an intimate knowledge of construction and excavation, and Brother Timothy Walsh, whose previous experience as a mortician would prove crucial to the monastery's dark operations. The monastery's official mission statement proclaimed its dedication to providing sanctuary for lost souls seeking redemption through prayer, meditation, and honest labor. Visitors were welcomed regardless of their ability to pay, with the understanding that those who could afford it would make donations to support the monastery's charitable work. This policy attracted a steady stream of vulnerable individuals who viewed Saint Bartholomew's as their last hope for finding peace and purpose in their troubled lives. The first documented visitor to disappear was Margaret Thompson, a 34-year-old widow From Billings, who arrived at the monastery in October 1903, Margaret had lost her husband and 2 young children in a house fire and had been struggling with overwhelming grief and survivor's guilt. Her sister Sarah had driven her to the monastery personally, expecting to return within a week to collect Margaret after she had completed her spiritual retreat. When Sarah returned as planned, she was told by Father Kowalski that Margaret had experienced a profound spiritual awakening and had decided to continue her journey to a convent in California where she planned to dedicate her life to serving God. Kowalski produced a letter allegedly written by Margaret, explaining her decision and asking her sister not to worry about her. The handwriting appeared authentic, and the sentiment seemed consistent with Margaret's deeply religious nature. However, something about the encounter troubled Sarah Thompson. She later wrote to her cousin in Chicago, describing how Father Kowalski had seemed nervous during their conversation, and how she had noticed what appeared to be fresh earth in several areas of the monastery grounds. More disturbing was her observation that Margaret's personal belongings, including a gold locket containing photographs of her deceased children, had apparently been left behind, despite the letter claiming she was continuing her spiritual journey. Similar patterns emerged over the following months and years. Visitors would arrive seeking spiritual guidance, often staying for periods ranging from a few days to several weeks. Family members or friends who came to collect them would be told that the person had experienced a religious revelation and had departed to join religious orders elsewhere. Letters would be produced as evidence, always written in the missing person's handwriting, always expressing gratitude for the monastery's guidance and requesting that loved ones not attempt to contact them during their period of spiritual transformation. The disappearances followed a careful selection process that investigators would later piece together from documents found hidden in the monastery walls. Father Kowalski and his associates specifically targeted individuals who met certain criteria. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They preferred visitors who were isolated from family and community support systems, people whose disappearance might not immediately trigger extensive searches. They sought out individuals carrying valuable possessions that could be sold to fund the monastery's operations. Most importantly, they selected people whose psychological profiles suggested they might plausibly choose to abandon their previous lives in pursuit of religious calling. Brother Marcus Chen maintained detailed psychological evaluations of every visitor, documenting their mental state, family relationships, financial resources, and likelihood of being missed if they failed to return home. These evaluations, written in a clinical style that portrayed Chen's medical training, reveal a systematic approach to identifying suitable victims. Visitors who were deemed inappropriate for the monastery's true purpose were genuinely provided with spiritual counseling and sent safely on their way, ensuring that Saint Bartholomew's maintained its reputation as a legitimate retreat center. The monastery's location proved perfect for concealing evidence of their crimes. The harsh mountain environment meant that the grounds were often covered in snow for 6 months of the year, making excavation difficult and concealing any signs of disturbed earth. The isolation ensured that screams or other sounds associated with violence would not be heard by anyone beyond the monastery walls. Most crucially, the treacherous access road meant that visitors typically arrived alone and that their vehicles could be easily disposed of in the deep mountain ravines that surrounded the plateau. Brother David O'Brien's construction expertise proved invaluable in creating hidden chambers beneath the monastery where victims could be held before their deaths. These underground rooms, carved directly into the rocky foundation, were accessible only through concealed entrances known to the core group of conspirators. The chambers were soundproof and equipped with heavy iron doors that could be secured from the outside. Here, victims were kept alive for days or sometimes weeks, while their captors decided how to best profit from their disappearance. The killing method that gave the monastery its reputation for burying living souls, was developed by Father Kowalski himself, who viewed it as a form of spiritual purification. Victims were sealed into wooden coffins while still alive and buried in carefully prepared graves scattered throughout the monastery grounds. The coffins were designed with small air holes that would provide enough oxygen to keep the victim conscious for several hours while they slowly suffocated in their underground prison. This horrific method served multiple purposes beyond satisfying Kowalski's twisted religious beliefs. The extended period of consciousness allowed victims to experience what Kowalski described as the ultimate spiritual test, facing death with time to contemplate their sins and seek divine forgiveness. The burial also ensured that bodies would be completely concealed, with no surface evidence of their location. Most practically, the method was relatively quiet, producing no sounds that might alert other visitors to what was happening. Brother Timothy Walsh's mortician background proved essential in managing the logistics of the murders. He supervised the construction of the special coffins, ensuring they would appear normal from the outside while containing the hidden air holes. He also developed techniques for preparing false documentation that would explain each victim's disappearance, including forged letters and fabricated evidence of their departure from the monastery. The conspiracy extended beyond the monastery walls to include accomplices in the surrounding community who helped dispose of evidence and maintain the cover story. Local merchant Henry Peterson purchased valuable items taken from victims, no questions asked, providing the monastery with a steady source of income. Sheriff Robert Martinez, whose jurisdiction included the monastery, was paid regular bribes to avoid investigating reports of missing persons who had last been seen traveling towards Saint Bartholomew's. Perhaps most shocking was the involvement of church authorities who were fully aware of the monastery's activities, but chose to protect the institution rather than the victims. Bishop William Harrison of the Helena Diocese received detailed reports about the disappearances as early as 1905, but decided that exposing the crimes would damage the Catholic Church's reputation in Montana. Instead, he worked with Father Kowalski to develop more sophisticated methods of concealing evidence and deflecting suspicion. The monastery's operations expanded significantly after 1910, when they began actively recruiting victims rather than simply waiting for troubled souls to arrive. Seeking help. Brother Chun traveled to cities throughout the western United States, visiting hospitals, poorhouses, and other institutions where he could identify individuals who met their selection criteria. He presented himself as a representative of a charitable religious organization offering free spiritual retreats to those in need. This expanded recruitment brought in dozens of additional victims, including entire families who were told they could find refuge and support at the monastery. The Wilson family from Denver arrived in 1912 after losing their farm to creditors. Parents James and Elizabeth Wilson, along with their 3 teenage children, were promised work and housing in exchange for helping with monastery operations. All 5 family members disappeared within a week of their arrival, with neighbors in Denver receiving a letter explaining that they had decided to homestead in Canada and would not be returning. The systematic nature of the murders is evident in the careful records maintained by the conspirators. A ledger discovered years later documented each victim's name, date of arrival, possessions confiscated, and burial location. The entries reveal the cold calculation behind each death, with victims evaluated primarily in terms of their monetary value and the risk their disappearance might pose to the operation. By 1920, the monastery grounds contained nearly 200 hidden graves, scattered throughout the property. The victims ranged in age from teenage runaways to elderly pilgrims, representing a cross-section of American society united only by their vulnerability and their tragic decision to seek help at Saint Bartholomew's. Their deaths had generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen possessions and donation money that funded the monastery's expansion and enrich the conspirators. The beginning of the end for Saint Bartholomew's came in 1921 when Dr. Catherine Mitchell, a physician from Boston, arrived at the monastery seeking treatment for what she described as a crisis of faith following her experiences treating wounded soldiers during World War I. Dr. Mitchell was different from the typical victims in several crucial ways. She was a respected professional with strong family connections who would definitely be missed if she disappeared. She had also informed several colleagues about her travel plans, creating a paper trail that would be difficult to explain away. More importantly, Dr. Mitchell's medical training made her observant of details that other visitors might have missed. She noticed inconsistencies in the monks' stories about previous visitors, observed areas of recently disturbed earth throughout the grounds, and became suspicious of the locked buildings that were supposedly used for storage but showed signs of recent occupancy. On her third night at the monastery, Dr. Mitchell was awakened by sounds coming from beneath her sleeping quarters. The sounds were unmistakably human, muffled voices that seemed to be pleading or crying for help. When she investigated the next morning, she discovered that the stone floor of a storage room showed signs of having been recently removed and replaced. More disturbing, she found several personal items that appeared to belong to recent visitors, including a woman's wedding ring and a child's toy that looked far too new to have been abandoned by previous guests. Dr. Mitchell's suspicions were confirmed when she observed Brother Chun and Brother O'Brien carrying what appeared to be an unconscious person toward one of the locked buildings during the pre-dawn hours of her fourth day at the monastery. Rather than confronting them directly, she decided to gather more evidence before taking action. Her medical bag contained a small camera that she used to document the suspicious areas of the grounds and the personal belongings she had discovered. The photographs Dr. Mitchell took would later prove crucial in exposing the monastery's crimes, but her investigation had not gone unnoticed. Father Kowalski realized that their newest visitor posed a significant threat to their operation and decided that she would have to be eliminated despite the risks involved. The plan was to drug Dr. Mitchell's evening meal and proceed with their standard burial procedure, with a cover story claiming she had suffered a heart attack during her spiritual retreat. However, Dr. Mitchell's medical training had made her cautious about consuming food or drink that she had not personally prepared. She had been carrying her own supplies and had avoided eating the monastery's meals after noticing a bitter taste that suggested the presence of some kind of sedative. When Brother Walsh brought her evening meal on her fifth night, she pretended to eat while actually disposing of the food, then feigned unconsciousness to see what would happen next. What Dr. Mitchell witnessed that night exceeded her worst fears about the monastery's activities. She observed as Brothers Chun and O'Brien entered her quarters, checked her pulse, and then carried her apparently unconscious body toward the underground chambers she had discovered earlier. Rather than struggling or crying out, she maintained her pretense of unconsciousness while memorizing every detail of the route they took in the layout of the hidden areas beneath the monastery. The underground chambers were even more horrific than she had imagined, containing evidence of dozens of previous victims, including personal belongings, clothing, and makeshift graves where bodies had been temporarily stored before their final burial. Most shocking was the discovery of several victims who were still alive, imprisoned in the stone cells while awaiting their turn to be buried. Dr. Mitchell realized that she was witnessing the final phase of a systematic murder operation that had been claiming lives for nearly 2 decades. Dr. Mitchell's heart pounded as she lay motionless in the underground chamber, forcing herself to maintain the pretense of unconsciousness while her captors discussed her fate in hushed tones just feet away. Through barely opened eyelids, she could see Brother Chun examining her pulse with clinical detachment, his medical training evident in the methodical way he checked her vital signs. Brother O'Brien stood nearby holding a lantern that cast dancing shadows on the rough stone walls, creating an atmosphere that seemed pulled from medieval nightmares. The chamber itself was larger than she had initially realized, carved directly into the bedrock beneath the monastery with impressive skill and attention to detail. The walls showed tool marks from years of careful excavation, and she could see multiple passages leading away into darkness, suggesting an extensive network of underground spaces. The air was thick with moisture and carried the unmistakable odor of human waste and decay, confirming her worst suspicions about what had transpired in these hidden depths. From her position on the cold stone floor, Dr. Mitchell could observe several cell-like openings along the chamber walls, each sealed with heavy wooden doors reinforced with iron bands. Muffled sounds emerged from behind these doors, weak voices calling for help or water, scratching sounds as imprisoned victims tried desperately to claw their way to freedom. The realization that multiple people were being held captive simultaneously suggested a level of organization and premeditation that exceeded anything she had imagined possible at a religious retreat. Brother Chun consulted a pocket watch and spoke in measured tones about timing and logistics, discussing Dr. Mitchell's case as if she were already dead. The conversation revealed that her elimination had been planned from the moment she arrived, with Father Kowalski recognizing immediately that her professional background and strong family connections made her unsuitable for their usual recruitment methods. They had allowed her to stay for several days only to maintain appearances and avoid suspicion from any colleagues who might inquire about her well-being. The medical training that had initially made Dr. Mitchell a threat now proved invaluable in helping her survive the immediate crisis. She had learned techniques for controlling her breathing and heart rate during her residency, skills that allowed her to maintain the appearance of unconsciousness even under close examination. More importantly, her anatomical knowledge helped her identify potential escape routes and assess the physical capabilities of her captors, information that would prove crucial in the hours ahead. As Brother Chun and Brother O'Brien prepared to transfer her to one of the holding cells, Dr. Mitchell overheard details about the monastery's operational procedures that provided insight into the scope of their criminal enterprise. The brothers discussed a schedule that involved processing multiple victims simultaneously, with different individuals at various stages of the elimination process. Some prisoners were being held for information about their financial assets. Others were awaiting the completion of forged documentation that would explain their disappearance, and still others were in the final stages before burial. The conversation also revealed the existence of external accomplices who helped facilitate the monastery's activities. References were made to contacts in various cities who identified potential victims and provided intelligence about their backgrounds and vulnerabilities. There were mentions of corrupt officials who ensured that missing person investigations would be delayed or misdirected, and of merchants who purchased stolen goods without asking uncomfortable questions about their origins. Brother O'Brien demonstrated particular pride in the engineering aspects of the underground complex, explaining to Brother Chun how the ventilation system had been designed to prevent the accumulation of dangerous gases while maintaining secrecy from the surface. The chambers were connected by a network of drainage channels that carried away waste and prevented flooding during the spring snowmelt. Most impressively, the entire complex had been excavated over a period of years without detection, with the excavated stone used for various construction projects around the monastery grounds. The holding cells themselves represented a masterpiece of cruel engineering, designed to maximize suffering while maintaining complete security. Each cell was barely large enough for a single occupant to lie down, with walls that tapered inward toward the ceiling to create a sense of crushing claustrophobia. The doors were constructed with small openings that allowed food and water to be passed through but prevented any possibility of escape or communication between prisoners. Dr. Mitchell learned that the cells served multiple purposes beyond simple imprisonment. They were used to break down victims psychologically, making them more compliant and less likely to attempt escape when they were eventually moved to their final resting place. The isolation and sensory deprivation experienced by prisoners often led to complete mental collapse within days, eliminating any risk that they might successfully resist their captors during the burial process. The brothers discussed specific cases that illustrated the effectiveness of their methods, describing how strong, healthy individuals had been reduced to cowering broken shells within a week of imprisonment. They took particular satisfaction in recounting cases where victims had actually begged for death as a release from their underground torment, viewing this psychological victory as evidence of their superior understanding of human nature. As the conversation continued, Dr. Mitchell began to piece together the organizational structure that enabled the monastery's crimes. Father Kowalski served as the overall leader and visionary, developing the theological justification for their actions and maintaining relationships with church authorities who provided protection from outside investigation. Brother Chen handled the medical and psychological aspects of victim selection and processing, using his clinical knowledge to maximize both the efficiency and the cruelty of their methods. Brother O'Brien functioned as the chief engineer and logistical coordinator, responsible for maintaining the underground facilities and managing the complex process of disposing of evidence. His construction background had been invaluable in creating the hidden chambers and developing techniques for concealing burial sites throughout the monastery grounds. Brother Walsh, though not present during this particular conversation, was referenced as the specialist responsible for creating false documentation and managing communications with the outside world. The financial aspects of the operation were also discussed in detail, revealing the substantial profits generated by their criminal activities. Beyond the obvious value of possessions stolen from victims, the monastery had developed multiple revenue streams that maximized their return on each elimination. Valuable items were sold through a network of accomplices in various cities, while less valuable possessions were disposed of locally through arrangements with corrupt merchants. More sophisticated was their practice of identity theft, using personal information obtained from victims to access bank accounts, claim insurance benefits, and even assume ownership of property in cases where legal documentation could be forged. Convincingly, Dr. Mitchell realized that many victims had essentially financed their own murders, with their stolen assets providing the resources necessary to expand and improve the monastery's killing capacity. The brothers made references to a detailed accounting system that tracked the financial return from each victim, with performance metrics that would have been appropriate for any legitimate business enterprise. This cold, calculating approach to murder revealed a level of moral detachment that Dr. Mitchell found almost as disturbing as the physical violence itself. These men had transformed killing into a routine business process, complete with quality control measures and efficiency improvements. As the discussion wound down, Brother Chen and Brother O'Brien began preparing for the next phase of Dr. Mitchell's processing. She listened as they debated whether to place her in one of the standard holding cells or to proceed directly to the final burial process, given the elevated risk she represented to their operation. The casual way they discussed ending her life, weighing practical considerations like timing and resource allocation, demonstrated how completely they had dehumanized their victims. The decision was made to hold her for several days while they completed the forgery of documents that would explain her disappearance to colleagues in Boston. This delay would provide time to search her belongings more thoroughly and to extract any information that might be valuable for future operations. Brother Chen expressed particular interest in her medical knowledge, wondering if her expertise might be useful in improving their techniques for managing prisoners or disposing of evidence. Dr. Mitchell realized that this delay represented her best and possibly only opportunity for escape. Once the forged documentation was completed and her elimination could proceed without raising immediate suspicions, she would join the nearly 200 victims already buried beneath the Montana soil. The knowledge that she had perhaps days or weeks before facing that horrific fate provided the motivation she needed to begin planning her survival strategy. As her captors prepared to transfer her to a holding cell, Dr. Mitchell used her medical training to assess her physical condition and identify any injuries that might affect her ability to escape. The drug they had intended to use on her evening meal would have left her genuinely unconscious and physically weakened, but her decision to avoid eating had left her with full access to her strength and mental faculties. This advantage, combined with her knowledge of the underground layout gained through forced observation, gave her hope that survival might be possible. The sound of approaching footsteps indicated that additional conspirators were joining Brother Chun and Brother O'Brien, suggesting that victim processing involved multiple participants working in coordination. Dr. Mitchell prepared herself for the most challenging performance of her life, knowing that any sign of consciousness would immediately result in additional security measures that would eliminate any possibility of escape. The voices grew louder as more members of the conspiracy entered the chamber, their casual conversation about murder and disposal creating a surreal contrast with the sacred setting of the monastery above. Dr. Mitchell closed her eyes completely and focused on controlling her breathing, preparing for whatever horrors awaited while secretly planning the moves that might yet save her life and expose the truth about Saint Bartholomew's darkest secrets. The iron doors slammed shut with a finality that echoed through the stone corridors, leaving Dr. Mitchell alone in a cell so narrow she could touch both walls simultaneously. The darkness was absolute, a suffocating blanket that seemed to press against her eyes and throat with physical weight. She forced herself to remain motionless for what felt like hours, listening as the footsteps of her captors faded into the labyrinthine passages that honeycombed the mountain beneath Saint Bartholomew's. When silence finally settled over the underground complex, Dr. Mitchell allowed herself to move for the first time since her capture. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest from the prolonged period of forced stillness, but she methodically stretched and flexed each limb to restore circulation and assess her physical condition. The cell was even smaller than it had appeared from the outside, measuring perhaps 4 feet wide by 6 feet long, with a ceiling so low that she could not stand upright without her head touching the rough stone above. The walls themselves told a story of previous occupants through scratches and stains that were visible even in the minimal light filtering through cracks in the door. Desperate fingernail marks scored the stone near the floor where prisoners had clawed at the walls in futile attempts to dig their way to freedom. Dark stains that could only be blood-marked areas where victims had injured themselves against the unforgiving surfaces, and carved messages in various languages spoke of terror, despair, and final prayers for salvation that would never come. Dr. Mitchell's medical training allowed her to interpret these signs with clinical accuracy, reconstructing the final days and weeks of victims who had occupied this same space before their elimination. The scratches suggested prolonged periods of frantic activity as prisoners sought any possible means of escape, while the bloodstains indicated the progressive deterioration of mental and physical health that resulted from extended confinement in such conditions. More disturbing were the messages themselves, which had been carved with fingernails, buttons, or small pieces of stone that prisoners had somehow managed to obtain. The inscriptions were in English, Spanish, German, and what appeared to be Polish, suggesting that the monastery's victims had been drawn from diverse immigrant communities throughout the Western United States. Many messages contained names and dates, creating an accidental record of disappearances that spanned nearly 2 decades. One inscription near the door caught Dr. Mitchell's attention immediately. Carved in careful block letters were the words, Sarah Williams, Denver, 1918. They drugged the Water Trust nitrogen monoxide 1. The message was followed by what appeared to be an arrow pointing toward a particular section of the cell wall. Dr. Mitchell ran her fingers along the indicated area and discovered that several stones had been deliberately loosened, creating a small hollow space that contained a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside the bundle, Dr. Mitchell found items that previous prisoners had somehow managed to conceal from their captors. There was a small pencil stub, several pieces of paper torn from what appeared to be a prayer book, and most importantly, a detailed map drawn on the back of a religious pamphlet. The map showed the layout of the underground complex with remarkable accuracy, including passages and chambers that Dr. Mitchell had not observed during her own forced tour of the facility. The map revealed that the underground network was far more extensive than she had realized, with multiple levels connected by steep passages carved into the bedrock. There were notations indicating the locations of storage areas, guard posts, and what appeared to be mass burial chambers where bodies were temporarily held before their final interment in the monastery grounds above. Most crucially, the map showed 2 potential escape routes that led to natural cave systems beyond the monastery's constructed tunnels. Accompanying the map were several pages of notes written in a careful feminine hand, apparently by the same Sarah Williams who had carved the warning message on the wall. The notes provided detailed observations about the guards' schedules, the timing of food deliveries, and the procedures used for moving prisoners between cells. Williams had apparently spent weeks studying her captors' routines, gathering intelligence that she hoped might help future victims escape their fate. According to Williams' notes, the underground complex operated on a strict schedule designed to maximize efficiency while minimizing the risk of detection from the monastery above. Guards made rounds every 4 hours, checking on prisoners and providing minimal amounts of food and water. The timing of these rounds was coordinated with activities in the main monastery to ensure that any sounds from below would be masked by prayer services, work activities, or meal preparation. The notes also contained disturbing details about the psychological techniques used to break down prisoners before their elimination. Victims were deliberately kept in uncertainty about their fate, with some being told they would be released while others were informed they would be killed, creating an atmosphere of constant terror and false hope. Food and water were provided irregularly and in insufficient quantities, weakening prisoners physically while making them dependent on their captors for survival. More insidious were the religious justifications provided for their treatment, with Father Kowalski and his associates presenting their actions as a form of spiritual purification that would ultimately benefit their victims' eternal souls. Prisoners were forced to participate in twisted prayer sessions, where they were required to confess their sins and express gratitude for the opportunity to achieve salvation through suffering. Dr. Mitchell realized that Sarah Williams had been an extraordinarily brave and intelligent woman who had used her final weeks of life to gather information that might help other victims. The fact that her notes had remained hidden for several years suggested that subsequent prisoners had either not discovered the cache or had been too psychologically damaged to make use of the intelligence she had compiled. The map showed that Dr. Mitchell's current cell was located in what Williams had labeled as the processing area, where new prisoners were held during their initial evaluation period. From here, victims were typically moved to long-term holding cells in a deeper section of the complex, or in cases where immediate elimination was deemed necessary, directly to the burial preparation chambers located near the natural cave entrances. Williams' notes indicated that the processing area offered the best opportunities for escape, as security was somewhat relaxed due to the assumption that newly captured victims would still be suffering from the effects of drugs or physical trauma. Guards in this section were less vigilant, and the proximity to both the entrance passages and the natural cave systems provided multiple potential escape routes for prisoners who could manage to free themselves from their cells. The challenge lay in actually escaping from the cell itself, which had been designed with prison security in mind. The door was constructed of heavy oak planks reinforced with iron bands and secured with a substantial lock that could not be opened from the inside. The walls were solid stone that would require tools and time to breach, neither of which were available to imprisoned victims. However, Williams' careful observations had revealed a potential weakness in the cell's construction. The builders had been forced to work around natural features in the bedrock, resulting in irregular shapes that required creative solutions to achieve the desired security. In Dr. Mitchell's cell, this had resulted in a section of wall where the stone blocks did not fit perfectly together, creating small gaps that could potentially be enlarged with persistent effort. More importantly, Williams had discovered that the cells were not completely isolated from each other. Sound could travel between adjacent chambers through cracks in the stone, and with careful effort, it was possible to communicate with other prisoners. This discovery had allowed Williams to coordinate with fellow victims and share information about escape opportunities and guard schedules. Dr. Mitchell immediately began testing this communication system, tapping quietly on the walls to determine if any of the adjacent cells were currently occupied. The response was immediate and heartbreaking. Weak tapping sounds emerged from at least 3 nearby cells, indicating that other victims were being held in similar conditions. Through a combination of tapping codes and whispered words that could barely penetrate the stone barriers, she began to establish contact with her fellow prisoners. The first voice she managed to identify belonged to an elderly man who introduced himself as Pastor Frank Mueller from a Lutheran church in Wyoming. Mueller had arrived at the monastery 3 weeks earlier seeking treatment for what he described as a crisis of faith following the death of his wife. His voice was weak and hoarse from dehydration, but his mind remained clear enough to provide valuable information about the facility's operations. Mueller reported that he had observed approximately a dozen other prisoners during his captivity, though many had been removed from their cells and had not returned. He had overheard conversations suggesting that some victims were being eliminated immediately upon arrival, while others were held for extended periods while their captors extracted information about their financial assets and family connections. Through the stone walls, Dr. Mitchell also made contact with a young woman named Emma Rodriguez who had been imprisoned for nearly 2 months. Rodriguez had originally come to the monastery with her teenage brother, seeking help for what she believed was his involvement with criminal elements in their hometown. The brother had disappeared within days of their arrival, and Rodriguez had been told he had chosen to join a religious order that required complete separation from family members. Rodriguez's extended captivity had given her extensive knowledge of the underground complex and its operations. She reported that the facility contained holding areas for different categories of victims, with separate sections for those awaiting elimination, those being held for ransom or financial exploitation, and those being kept alive for other purposes that she preferred not to describe in detail. Most disturbing was Rodriguez's report that the monastery's activities had been expanding significantly in recent months. She had observed increasing numbers of new arrivals and had overheard discussions about plans to establish similar operations in other remote locations throughout the Mountain West. The success of Saint Bartholomew's had apparently attracted the attention of criminal organizations seeking to replicate their methods elsewhere. The communication network that Dr. Mitchell had discovered represented more than just a means of sharing information between victims. It provided evidence of human resilience and the refusal to surrender hope, even in the most desperate circumstances. The prisoners who had developed these communication methods had maintained their humanity and their concern for others, even while facing their own mortality. As the hours passed in the suffocating darkness, Dr. Mitchell began to formulate a plan that would require the cooperation of multiple prisoners and precise timing to succeed. The intelligence gathered by Sarah Williams and the current prisoners provided the foundation for an escape attempt, but success would depend on factors beyond their control and would require courage that none of them was certain they possessed. The breakthrough came on Dr. Mitchell's 4th night in captivity, when Emma Rodriguez managed to work loose a stone from the wall separating their cells. The opening was barely large enough to pass small objects through, but it revolutionized their ability to coordinate escape plans and share crucial resources. Through this gap, Rodriguez passed Dr. Mitchell a piece of metal that had been painstakingly shaped into a crude lockpick by previous prisoners using nothing but stone surfaces and endless patience. The metal fragment had originally been part of a belt buckle belonging to a victim whose name was now lost to history, but whose ingenuity lived on in the carefully crafted tool. Each edge had been honed to specific angles through hundreds of hours of grinding against the stone walls, creating an instrument that could potentially manipulate the internal mechanisms of the heavy locks securing their cells. Rodriguez whispered that the tool had been passed between prisoners for years, with each victim adding refinements based on their own attempts at escape. Dr. Mitchell's medical training proved invaluable in understanding the mechanics of lock manipulation, as her knowledge of anatomy and fine motor control translated surprisingly well to the delicate work required for picking locks. She spent hours in the absolute darkness, familiarizing herself with the tool's shape and practicing the precise movements that would be necessary to manipulate tumblers she could not see. The lock itself was a massive iron mechanism that had been forged specifically for the monastery's security needs. Unlike commercial locks that might have standardized components, this device had been handcrafted by Brother O'Brien using techniques learned during his apprenticeship as a blacksmith. The unusual design made it more difficult to pick, but also meant that its construction followed patterns that could be analyzed and exploited by someone with sufficient patience and skill. Through whispered conversations that stretched across multiple nights, the prisoners developed an intelligence network that would have impressed military strategists. Pastor Mueller used his position in the cell closer to the guard station to monitor the movement patterns of their captors, while Rodriguez tracked the timing of food deliveries and shift changes. Dr. Mitchell coordinated these observations with the information contained in Sarah Williams' hidden notes, creating a comprehensive picture of the facility's operational schedule. The guards' routines were more complex than initially apparent, with multiple layers of security designed to prevent exactly the type of coordinated escape attempt the prisoners were planning. Primary security consisted of 2 guards who maintained constant presence in the underground complex, checking cells every 4 hours and responding to any unusual sounds or disturbances. Secondary security involved irregular patrols by Brother Chun or Brother O'Brien, who would conduct surprise inspections to ensure that prisoners remained properly secured and had not attempted to communicate with each other. Most challenging was the tertiary security provided by Father Kowalski himself, who made unpredictable visits to the underground chambers as part of what he described as pastoral care for the condemned souls in his custody. These visits typically involved religious ceremonies where Kowalski would pray over selected prisoners, offering them opportunities for final confession before their elimination. The timing of these visits was deliberately irregular to prevent prisoners from planning around them. The prisoners discovered that their best opportunity for escape would come during the early morning hours, when the regular guards were typically at their least alert and the chances of surprise inspections were minimal. However, this window of opportunity lasted only about 90 minutes before the monastery above began its daily routine of prayers and work activities that would bring additional people into proximity with the underground complex. Dr. Mitchell realized that successful escape would require not just freeing themselves from their cells, but also neutralizing the guards and reaching the surface without triggering alarms that would bring the entire monastery down on them. The task seemed impossible given their weakened physical condition and complete lack of weapons, but the alternative was certain death in the horrific burial chambers that awaited all of Saint Bartholomew's prisoners. The turning point came when Rodriguez revealed information she had been reluctant to share about the fate of previous escape attempts. Several prisoners over the years had managed to free themselves from their cells using various improvised tools and techniques, but all had ultimately failed to reach safety. Their failures, however, had provided valuable intelligence about the obstacles that any successful escape would need to overcome. The most significant challenge was the guard station that controlled access to the main passage leading to the surface. This checkpoint was always manned by at least one armed guard, who maintained visual contact with the primary cell block through a system of mirrors and reflected landlight that Brother O'Brien had engineered. Any movement in the cell area would be immediately detected, making it impossible for prisoners to approach the guard station unnoticed. However, Rodriguez had observed that the guard station's field of vision had blind spots created by the irregular shape of the natural cave system that housed the underground complex. A previous prisoner had discovered that by following a specific route that took advantage of these blind spots, it was possible to approach within striking distance of the guard position without being detected. The challenge was timing this approach to coincide with moments when the guard's attention was directed elsewhere. The prisoners also learned about secondary obstacles that would face anyone who managed to overcome the initial security. The passage to the surface was secured by multiple locked doors, each requiring either keys carried by the guards or specialized knowledge of hidden mechanisms that controlled the locking systems. Even if these barriers could be overcome, the final exit from the underground complex was protected by an alarm system that would immediately alert the entire monastery to any unauthorized movement. Despite these daunting obstacles, Dr. Mitchell began to formulate a plan that might succeed where previous attempts had failed. The key insight came from combining her medical knowledge with the intelligence gathered by other prisoners and the detailed observations recorded by Sarah Williams. Rather than attempting a conventional escape that relied on stealth and surprise, she proposed using the monastery's own operational procedures against their captors. The plan centered on exploiting Father Kowalski's pastoral visits, which represented the only time when high-ranking members of the conspiracy entered the cell block without the full security protocols that protected the regular guards. If they could time their escape attempt to coincide with one of these visits, they might be able to capture Kowalski and use him as leverage to secure their passage to the surface. Dr. Mitchell's medical training would be crucial in this approach, as she possessed knowledge of pressure points and neural manipulation techniques that could incapacitate even a strong opponent without causing permanent injury. More importantly, her professional background gave her credibility that might convince other conspirators to negotiate rather than risk harming someone who could potentially expose their entire operation if she survived to reach outside authorities. The psychological aspects of the plan were as important as the physical elements. The prisoners would need to overcome months or years of conditioning designed to break their will and convince them that resistance was futile. They would need to act decisively despite their weakened physical condition and the terror that had been systematically instilled through prolonged captivity in the underground chambers. Rodriguez revealed that she had been maintaining her physical strength through a careful exercise regimen performed in complete silence during the hours when guards were least likely to be monitoring the cells. She had also been hoarding portions of her meager food rations to ensure she would have the energy necessary for any escape attempt. Her preparations demonstrated the kind of long-term planning and mental discipline that would be essential for success. Pastor Mueller contributed theological insights that proved surprisingly relevant to their tactical planning. His understanding of Father Kowalski's twisted religious philosophy allowed him to predict how the monastery's leader might react to various scenarios and to identify psychological pressure points that could be exploited during any confrontation. Mueller's analysis revealed that Kowalski's greatest fear was exposure of his activities to church authorities, a vulnerability that could potentially be exploited. The prisoners spent days refining their plan and practicing the precise timing that would be required for each phase of the escape attempt. They used a communication network to coordinate their preparations and to ensure that each person understood their specific role in the operation. The plan was complex and dependent on numerous variables beyond their control, but it represented their only realistic hope for survival. As they prepared for what might be their final gamble, the prisoners were sustained by more than just hope. For personal survival, they carried with them the responsibility of bearing witness to the crimes they had observed and ensuring that the nearly 200 victims buried beneath the monastery grounds would not be forgotten. Their escape would not just save their own lives, but potentially prevent countless future murders by exposing the truth about Saint Bartholomew's darkest secrets. The night chosen for their attempt arrived with the kind of blizzard that was common in the Montana mountains during late autumn. The howling wind and driving snow would provide natural cover for any sounds associated with their escape, while the severe weather would make it difficult for the monastery's inhabitants to pursue them. Even if their attempt was discovered, Dr. Mitchell gripped the improvised lockpick with hands that trembled from both cold and anticipation, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether she lived to expose the truth about the monastery that buried living souls. The lock yielded to Dr. Mitchell's careful manipulation just as the monastery bell tolled 3 in the morning, its bronze voice carrying through the stone corridors with mournful resonance. The mechanism clicked open with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the underground silence, but the howling blizzard above masked any noise that might have alerted the guards to their activities. She eased the heavy door open just wide enough to slip through, her heart hammering against her ribs as she emerged into the main corridor for the first time since her capture. The passage was dimly lit by oil lamps mounted in iron brackets along the walls, casting shifting shadows that created the illusion of movement in every direction. Dr. Mitchell moved with the careful precision of someone whose life depended on absolute silence, following the route that Sarah Williams had mapped years earlier. Each step was placed with deliberate care to avoid loose stones that might shift under her weight, while her eyes constantly scanned the darkness ahead for any sign of the guards whose positions she had memorized through days of careful observation. Rodriguez emerged from her cell moments later, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had spent months preparing for this moment. Despite her extended captivity, she had maintained remarkable physical condition through her secret exercise regimen, and her movements showed none of the hesitation that might be expected from someone who had been imprisoned for so long. She carried with her a collection of improvised weapons crafted from materials scavenged within her cell, including sharpened pieces of stone and strips of cloth that could be used as bindings. Pastor Muller's liberation required more assistance, as his advanced age and prolonged imprisonment had taken a greater physical toll. However, his mind remained sharp, and his knowledge of the facility's layout proved invaluable as they navigated through passages that connected the cell block to the central areas of the underground complex. Mueller whispered directions in barely audible tones, guiding them around obstacles and potential dead ends that could trap them if they were discovered by the guards. The guard station appeared ahead exactly as Rodriguez had described it, positioned at the intersection of 3 major passages in a location that provided optimal control over movement throughout the underground network. Through careful observation, they could see a single guard seated at a wooden table, his attention focused on a ledger where he was recording routine maintenance notes. The man appeared relaxed and comfortable, clearly not expecting any disturbance during what was typically the quietest period of the night shift. Dr. Mitchell studied the guard's position and movements for several minutes, analyzing his patterns and identifying the moment when he would be most vulnerable to surprise. The man periodically rose from his chair to check the mirror system that allowed him to monitor the cell areas, but these inspections followed a predictable routine that left him exposed during the intervals when he returned to his paperwork. The attack was swift and precise, utilizing techniques that Dr. Mitchell had learned during her medical training for restraining delirious patients. She approached from the guard's blind spot while he was bent over his ledger, applying pressure to specific nerve points that induced immediate unconsciousness without causing permanent injury. The guard slumped forward onto his papers without making a sound, his breathing remaining steady and regular as he entered a state of enforced sleep that would last for at least an hour. Rodriguez quickly searched the unconscious guard for keys and weapons, discovering a ring of iron keys that appeared to fit the various locks throughout the facility. More importantly, she found a loaded pistol that significantly improved their chances of dealing with any additional resistance they might encounter. The guard also carried written orders that revealed crucial information about the monastery's current operations, including a schedule showing that Father Kowalski was expected to conduct a pastoral visit to the cell block within the next 2 hours. This intelligence forced them to revise their escape timeline, as discovery of the guard's incapacitation would certainly trigger a facility-wide alarm that would make reaching the surface impossible. They needed to complete their escape and put significant distance between themselves and the monastery before dawn brought additional security measures into play. Mueller suggested that they could use the guard's own communication system to delay discovery by sending routine status reports that would convince other conspirators that everything remained normal. The passage to the surface proved more challenging than anticipated, with multiple security checkpoints that had not been fully documented in the intelligence they had gathered. Each door required a different key from the guard's collection, and several featured additional locking mechanisms that demanded specific knowledge of hidden catches and counterweights. Rodriguez's mechanical aptitude proved invaluable in solving these puzzles, as her experience working in her father's machine shop had given her an intuitive understanding of how complex mechanisms functioned. At the third checkpoint, they encountered evidence that made their blood run cold and confirmed their worst fears about the scope of the monastery's crimes. A storage chamber contained hundreds of personal belongings, sorted and cataloged with the same systematic precision that might be found in a commercial warehouse. Wedding rings, pocket watches, family photographs, and religious items filled wooden crates that were labeled with dates. Spanning nearly 2 decades of systematic murder, Dr. Mitchell recognized several items that had belonged to victims whose disappearances she had researched, including a distinctive locket that had been described in missing person reports filed by desperate family members. The sheer volume of possessions demonstrated that the monastery's crimes extended far beyond even their most pessimistic estimates, with evidence suggesting that hundreds of people had been murdered and buried in the mountain soil over the years. More disturbing was the discovery of detailed records that documented not just the victims' possessions, but information about their families, financial assets, and social connections. The monastery had been systematically harvesting personal information that enabled them to assume identities, access bank accounts, and even claim inheritance benefits in cases where victims had no surviving relatives to challenge fraudulent claims. The records revealed that the monastery's operations were part of a much larger criminal network that extended throughout the Western United States and potentially beyond. References to similar facilities in other remote locations suggested that Saint Bartholomew's was not unique, but rather one node in an organized system of murder and theft that operated under the protection of corrupt religious and civil authorities. As they climbed toward the surface through passages that grew progressively narrower and more treacherous, the 3 escapees could hear sounds from the monastery above, beginning their daily routine. The early morning prayers had commenced, with dozens of voices joining in hymns that created a haunting counterpoint to the horrors they had witnessed below. The irony of sacred music floating over the graves of murder victims was not lost on any of them. The final barrier to freedom was a concealed entrance located behind the monastery's main altar, hidden beneath a stone slab that required combined strength to lift. The opening was barely large enough for a single person to squeeze through, and its location in the most sacred area of the monastery meant that their emergence would immediately expose them to any monks who might be participating in the morning service. Rodriguez volunteered to go first, using her smaller stature to scout the situation above and ensure that the coast was clear for the others to follow. She disappeared through the opening with only the faintest scraping of stone against cloth, leaving Dr. Mitchell and Pastor Mueller to wait in terrifying uncertainty for her signal that it was safe to proceed. The minutes that followed felt like hours as they listened to the continued sounds of religious observance above, wondering if Rodriguez had been captured or if she was simply being cautious in her reconnaissance. Every creak of settling timber, every footstep on the wooden floors above sent waves of terror through the two remaining prisoners as they imagined discovery at the moment when freedom was finally within reach. Rodriguez's whispered "all clear" finally came just as the morning hymns reached their conclusion, indicating that the monks were dispersing to begin their daily work activities. Dr. Mitchell emerged first, finding herself in a storage area filled with religious artifacts and ceremonial items. The juxtaposition of sacred objects with the entrance to a mass murder facility created a scene of surreal horror that would haunt her dreams for years to come. Pastor Mueller's emergence required assistance due to his physical limitations, but his determination to escape and bear witness to the crimes he had observed drove him to endure the painful climb through the narrow passage. Once all three were safely in the storage area, they faced the challenge of leaving the monastery grounds without being detected by the residents, who were beginning their daily activities throughout the complex. The blizzard that had provided cover for their underground escape now became both blessing and curse as they attempted to navigate the treacherous mountain paths leading away from Saint Bartholomew's. The driving snow concealed their movements from any observers, but it also made travel extremely dangerous and disorienting. Without proper winter clothing or adequate food supplies, they faced the very real possibility of dying from exposure. Even if they successfully evaded pursuit, Dr. Mitchell's medical knowledge proved crucial in managing their survival during the harrowing descent from the monastery plateau. She recognized the early signs of hypothermia in all three escapees and implemented warming techniques that prevented their condition from becoming life-threatening. Her understanding of human physiology also helped them pace their exertion to avoid exhaustion while maintaining the rapid progress necessary to stay ahead of any search parties. The first sign of civilization appeared after nearly 12 hours of desperate travel through the mountain wilderness, when they spotted smoke rising from a remote cabin occupied by a trapper who had been living in isolation for several years. The man, Thomas Brennan, was initially suspicious of the three desperate refugees who appeared at his door, but Dr. Mitchell's professional credentials and the obvious sincerity of their terror convinced him that they were telling the truth about their experiences. Brennan provided them with warm clothing, hot food, and most importantly, access to his radio equipment that allowed them to contact federal authorities in Helena. The initial response was skeptical, as their claims about systematic murder at a respected religious institution seemed too outrageous to be credible. However, Dr. Mitchell's detailed knowledge of the underground facility and her ability to describe specific evidence that could be verified convinced the authorities to launch an immediate investigation. Federal agents arrived at Saint Bartholomew's Monastery within 24 hours of receiving the escapees' report, finding a scene that exceeded even Dr. Mitchell's horrific descriptions. The underground complex contained 43 prisoners in various stages of the elimination process, some of whom had been held captive for over a year. The systematic torture and psychological abuse that had been inflicted on these victims represented some of the most severe human rights violations ever documented on American soil. The excavation of the monastery grounds revealed the remains of 189 murder victims buried in carefully concealed graves throughout the property. Each burial site had been precisely planned to maximize concealment while ensuring that the decomposing remains would enhance the fertility of the soil used for the monastery's agricultural operations. The victims ranged in age from teenagers to elderly pilgrims, representing a cross-section of American society united only by their vulnerability and their tragic decision to seek help at Saint Bartholomew's. Father Vincent Kowalski and his corps. Conspirators were arrested without resistance, apparently having anticipated that their crimes would eventually be exposed. The evidence collected from the underground complex and the monastery's records provided prosecutors with overwhelming proof of systematic murder, torture, and fraud spanning nearly 2 decades. The trial that followed became one of the most significant criminal cases in Montana history, exposing not just the specific crimes at Saint Bartholomew's, but the broader network of corruption that had enabled such atrocities to continue for years. The convictions resulted in death sentences for Kowalski and 3 of his primary accomplices, while other participants received lengthy prison terms that ensured they would never again threaten innocent victims. More importantly, the investigation led to reforms in oversight of religious institutions and improvements in missing person investigation procedures that helped prevent similar crimes in other locations. Dr. Catherine Mitchell devoted the remainder of her career to working with trauma survivors and advocating for victims' rights, using her harrowing experience to help others recover from similar ordeals. She established a foundation that provided support for families of missing persons and funded research into the psychological techniques used by criminal organizations to manipulate and control their victims. The site of Saint Bartholomew's Monastery was converted into a memorial dedicated to the 189 victims whose lives were cut short by the twisted vision of men who perverted religious faith to justify their crimes. The memorial serves as a reminder that evil can hide behind the most sacred facades and that vigilance is required to protect the vulnerable from those who would exploit their desperation and trust. Pastor Frank Mueller and Emma Rodriguez both survived their ordeal and became powerful advocates for criminal justice reform, sharing their experiences to help law enforcement agencies better understand the methods used by organized criminal groups. Their testimony was instrumental in securing convictions and in developing new techniques for investigating complex conspiracy cases. The legacy of Saint Bartholomew's extends far beyond the specific crimes committed within its walls, serving as a stark reminder of humanity's capacity for both unimaginable cruelty and remarkable resilience. The courage displayed by Dr. Mitchell and her fellow survivors in escaping from seemingly impossible circumstances and bringing their tormentors to justice demonstrates that even the most carefully planned criminal enterprises can be defeated by ordinary people who refuse to surrender their hope and their determination to seek justice. The monastery that once buried living souls now stands as a testament to the power of truth to triumph over even the most sophisticated attempts at concealment and deception. The voices of the victims, silenced by violence but not forgotten, continue to speak through the memorial that honors their memory and ensures that their sacrifice will contribute to a more just and compassionate world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.